Rioso, and welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, episode 238, Cardiff, Creating a Boomtown. In today's episode, we're going to explore a few things about Cardiff and the establishment of it as changing from a sleepy little village into something much more, and what was the primary drivers of that. One part of this, of course, is a intense rivalry between two prominent figures in Victorian Cardiff, one of whom was John Batchelor, a passionate liberal politician and businessman. The other, John Crichton-Stuart, better known to us today as the third Marquess of Bute, a powerful aristocrat and industrial magnate, and I would also a builder and protector, one could say, of ancient ruins. Their conflict not only influenced the political and also the economic landscape of Cardiff, but also left a lasting imprint on its architectural heritage and on the city as a whole. At the start of the 19th century, Cardiff was little more than a market town nestled along the River Taff. Its ancient roots reached back to the Roman times, and probably before that. We just don't have a lot of evidence of it at this point. Simply because of its location, it would have been a significant spot to have Iron Age people living there, but we don't know for sure. There isn't tons of evidence one way or the other, so it's just an assumption I myself made rather than actual evidence. But by 1801, Cardiff's population was still relatively tiny at 1,800 people. It was quiet, rural, and far from the powerhouse it would become. To understand Cardiff's transformation, we need to talk about the South Wales coalfields. As we mentioned before, as the Industrial Revolution continued to gain momentum in Britain, coal was, of course, king. It powered factories, ships, and homes to this point. As South Wales had some of its richest coal seams in the world, that made it an incredibly important place for a growing empire. But coal deep in the valleys needed a way to reach the outside world, preferably a port. Enter the Glamorganshire Canal, completed in 1790. We have mentioned something about this earlier, which connected Merthyr Tydfil ironworks to Cardiff. It wasn't perfect, slow, and prone to congestion, but it was Cardiff's first big step towards becoming an export hub. By early 1800s, iron and coal were making their way down the canal to Cardiff's primitive dock facilities. Cardiff's population exploded from just under 2,000 in 1801 to over 26,000 by 1851, and by 1871 it surged past 38,000 people. They came from all over Wales, England, and even further afield, places like Ireland, for example, and other parts of Europe. Of course, the West Country in general would bring in a lot of people from Bristol and surrounding area, but it's important to note they were all drawn to the city because of the promise of employment. This influx of people brought with it changes and challenges of rapid urbanization. As you can imagine, housing struggled to keep up with the demand, and living conditions, especially in the poorer dockside areas like Tiger Bay, could be harsh. Sanitation, of course, was limited. Disease outbreaks were common, as they were throughout Britain at this time in urban areas, and working-class families often lived in cramped quarters. Yet, despite the hardships, communities flourished. Now, of course, we can't begin to tell this story without mentioning John Crichton-Stuart, second Marquess of Bute, which is a person who was incredibly important to the Victorian areas of Cardiff. The Bute family owned vast lands around Cardiff, and the second Marquess saw the potential in turning the town into a vast major port. Under his guidance, Bute West Docks opened in 1839. It was an ambitious engineering feat, and it transformed the sleepy port into a bustling industrial hub. For the first time, Cardiff could handle large volumes of coal exports efficiently, and the world took notice. If you look at a map and you see where Merthyr is and where the valleys generally point down to, it's easy to understand why Cardiff becomes the center point of all this. The reality was, previous to this, Swansea, Abertawe, if you want to say it in Welsh, was a much more populous community and had been a central point for shipbuilding and other things throughout its history. But because of the way that the funneling happened out of the valleys, it made way more sense to move things to Cardiff than to ship them all the way to Swansea, which was much farther away and a lot more awkward to get to via train travel. So it makes sense. And because of that, it opened up an opportunity for people like the Buttes to really take advantage of the area and make it their own. The success of the West Dock led to the opening of additional docks, including the East Dock in 1855 and the Roath Basin in 1859. These developments turned Cardiff into the premier coal exporting port in the world by 1860. Not everyone celebrated the Bute monopoly, as you could imagine. Born in Newport in 1820, John Batchelor moved to Cardiff in 1843 at the age of 23, obviously doing a little math, establishing a timber business with his brother. Beyond his entrepreneurial pursuits, Batchelor was deeply involved in politics, aligning with the group we know very well, the liberal nonconformist movement that sought to challenge the entrenched power structures of the time. He was a vocal advocate for municipal reform and played a pivotal role in breaking the Bute family's political dominance by supporting the election of liberal nonconformist candidates, something that would have been incredibly important and vital in order to reach the goal of changing the democracy that they were living in. The third Marquess of Bute, John Crichton-Stuart, inherited the vast estates and immense wealth, becoming one of the most influential figures in Cardiff's development. His vision and investments were instrumental in transforming Cardiff into a major coal exporting port. The Bute family efforts led to the creation of the docks and the expansion of the coal trade we mentioned earlier, which of course boosted local economy, which is why we have this driving presence of labor to Cardiff at this time. As Cardiff's population swelled and industry flourished, political awareness and civic engagement began to take root. The Industrial Revolution didn't just change the way people worked, it changed how they saw their place in society. And in Cardiff, politics began to reflect that shift. At the center of this political shift, of course, were the two men we've been discussing. The crux of the conflict between Batchelor and the Marquis lay in their divergent views of Cardiff. Batchelor championed the cause of the working class and sought to democratize the city's governance, often opposing the monopolistic tendencies of the Bute family. He was instrumental in developing the Penarth docks, aimed to create an alternative to the Bute-controlled Cardiff docks, thereby reducing the family's stranglehold on the coal trade in the area. In the early 19th century, political power in Cardiff was still dominated by the landowning elites, which of course was preeminently the Bute family. The Marquis's influence stretched beyond the docks, and he held significant sway over local governance, and the town's small corporations were largely a closed shop. But in the 1830s, national political reform began to ripple into the Welsh towns. The Reform Act of 1832 extended the vote to more middle-class men, especially property-owning businessmen, who had benefited from Cardiff's booming economy. It was a small step, but an important one in an area with growing wealth and growing labor. After gaining borough status, Cardiff's local businessmen and industrialists, many of them nonconformists, liberals, and reformers, began to challenge the aristocratic control of civic affairs. Political debates grew lively. Tensions often arose between the conservative interests, closely tied to the Bute estate and the Anglican Church, and the liberal reformers like Batchelor, who pushed for education, improving housing, and public health reform. These tensions mirrored wider class divisions as well as religious ones: Anglican versus nonconformist, aristocrat versus tradesman, employer versus worker. All of this we've talked in depth about over the last few months, and workers were increasingly making their voices heard. Trade unions began to emerge in Cardiff in the 1850s and 60s, particularly amongst the dock workers and the railway employees. While strikes and protests were still relatively rare at this time, a growing working class consciousness was evident. Perhaps most significantly, Cardiff's growing political life showed how urban development and civic identity go hand in hand. As more people settled in the town, they began to shape its future, not just with labor and bricks, but with ballots and public meetings. The Marquis, perceiving Batchelor and his reformers' initiatives as a direct threat to his family's interests, allegedly used his considerable influence to undermine Batchelor's business ventures. In the early 1860s, Batchelor was evicted from his timber yard in the Cardiff docks by the Marquis. Although he relocated his business, he suffered significant financial losses, exacerbated by a global financial panic of 1866, ultimately leading to his bankruptcy. Now, while we focus a little bit on these men, I want to also talk in large part about different aspects of Cardiff and what was going on there. So the larger reasons behind why these two men had become more prominent. Now, if we were to talk about one aspect, of course, it's the arrival of so many people also drives a need for a leisure environment, something for people to do outside of just work. And at the heart for the working class was the public house, or pub as they're now more commonly called. Cardiff's rapidly expanding docklands were dotted with taverns and alehouses that served as gathering places for sailors, laborers, and tradesmen. It also wasn't uncommon, I should point this out, to find pubs near churches too, which is an interesting little dichotomy. Sometimes they're even owned by those churches at times. I won't say that's the case in Cardiff, but I've definitely heard that about some of them. In the bustling neighborhood of Bute Town, which would later be known as Tiger Bay and then change yet again later, you could find dock workers rubbing shoulders with seafarers from Ireland, the West Indies, and beyond. Cardiff was becoming a multicultural town, and its pubs reflected that mix, full of song, dialect, and of course, debate. Pubs weren't just places to drink, however, they were hubs for storytelling, political talk, and social networking. Many even doubled as informal job markets where men could find work on the docks or on board ships. Of course, not everyone approved of this boisterous nightlife, of course. Nonconformist chapels of Methodists, Baptists, and Congregationalists were incredibly influential in 19th century Cardiff. These chapels weren't just spiritual centers, but they would also become social hubs of their own. Sunday school, temperance meetings, of course, a big part of the anti-pub thing, choirs, lectures, and charity events all brought communities together under one roof. The chapel was especially central to the middle-class lifestyle and to the growing liberal political movement. Many Welsh-speaking migrants from the valleys and the countryside found a familiar and supportive environment in Cardiff's nonconformist congregations. And then there were the temperance societies, something we haven't really discussed yet, which were emerging in this part of the century, campaigning against the evils of alcohol, something that is not just located in Wales or in Britain, but actually is a movement across most of the Western world, especially the Western English-speaking world, because you had movements like this in Canada, in the United States, and elsewhere that were growing, and with it also were women's political movements, almost hand in hand in some ways. But nonetheless, the temperate societies were becoming very popular and very influential. They, of course, added a moral tension to Cardiff's social life, especially as drunkenness and disorderly conduct was often cited in newspaper columns and court reports. In other words, if they're drunk, they must be criminals, would definitely be a conclusion some people in that era might have made. Another aspect of a growing need for distraction and entertainment, as populations grew, so did the appetite for more of that. Cardiff may not have had grand theaters in the early 1800s, but by the 1850s and 60s, you could find traveling shows, penny theaters, and music halls popping up around the town. Singing and storytelling remained key forms of entertainment, as you can imagine. I can even tell you stories of riding buses back from the center of town in the evening and listening to people randomly picking up songs and just singing them on the bus, which was mind-blowing to my little Canadian perspective. That's just something that would happen out of nowhere. So I can believe that this would be a key form of entertainment even back then, and was often, of course, All of this passed down through families and performed in communal settings. But again, I don't know, is a bus a communal setting? I guess it is. Cardiff also began to develop a sporting culture. Cricket clubs, one of the first major major team sports, developed at this time and emerged amongst the middle and upper classes, while football, still in its rougher pre-rules, is it rugby? Is it football? Is it American football? We don't really know because there's no rules to this. Is still in and around playing in fields and yards amongst mostly working class people, but I don't think it's only them. And it is an interesting thing to look at when you look at similarly designed football-like games that are played in places in England now. The violence and just the general sense of chaos that comes out of those really does harken back to this concept of what the old idea of football was. And it's an interesting thing to compare to and understand. And of course, soon after this, you will get the break between rugby and football as rules are codified and the whole way that these two games work changes dramatically. Rowing on the Taff, the river, and boxing matches grew and drew crowds, as did horse racing events just outside of town, which attracted visitors from, of course, across South Wales. Fairs and festivals still dotted the calendar, especially around St. Mary's Street and the Hayes, which buzzed with vendors, performers, and revelers during the feast days and the market weeks. For those of you that have ever been to Cardiff, you'll know St. Mary's Street is still one of the prominent streets, comes off of the castle, and is still super commercialized even now between all of the things that have gone on. It's changed over the years, but it's still much more of a commercial street than anything else, and is one of those places where you have to walk down and experience, along with, I would argue, other places. But this is not a travel log, I'm just saying. Of course, Cardiff's social life was deeply influenced by class. For the wealthier families, industrialists, shipping magnates, and landowners, life meant drawing rooms, subscription libraries, and private dining parties. Meanwhile, working class families often made their own fun on tighter budgets. Street games, sing-songs, and storytelling are some of those commonalities. And I would argue that even though there might have been different ways of doing it, I'm pretty sure that there were still similar-ish ideas between both classes on how to have fun. I don't think people change dramatically enough in that respect. It may be the amount of fun or the amount of lubrication, shall we say, that leads into it, that's probably different. But amid these differences, there was a strong sense of community, whether in the chapel, the pub, the docks, or the markets. Cardiff's people created social spaces that helped them navigate the pressures of industrial life. By 1870, Cardiff was no longer just a town of ships and coal. It was a living, breathing city full of laughter, conflict, culture, and connection. And while its skylines kept changing, its heartbeat came from its people. Which is a very poetic and dramatic way of just saying, at the end of the day, is that Cardiff became a proper city instead of being a small industrial town, and that there was a diverse and thriving communal environment. So, take whichever paragraph you want as your choice. Of course, while all this building and communal efforts were being made as the politics was happening, there was another side to all of this. While rivalries were playing out in political and economic arenas, the Marquis left an indelible mark on Cardiff's architectural landscape. Collaborating with architect William Burgess, the Marquis embarked on an ambitious project that epitomized the Gothic Revival style. I would counter that by saying the phony baloney Victorian style, but that's neither here nor there. This led to one of my least favorite aspects of Victorian medievalism, this reuse of ruins to build something that matched their ideas about what a medieval life would be like. With it, they made grand palaces, and they made things that are called follies, which are effectively rebuilt, or in some cases, built from whole cloth, imagined buildings, no different really than the Cinderella's castle at Walt Disney World. The reality is that these buildings are fun. They're interesting to look at. They do give us a window into a specific time and what those people thought a medieval building would look like. But if you enter, as examples, Cardiff Palace or Castell Coch, keep in mind those are not medieval buildings in the way we look at them, and they should not be examined as medieval buildings any more than I would take uh, Mark Twain's uh, novel about King Arthur anymore a medieval history. These things are what they are, but let's keep that all in point of view. And I've made this point a few times, so I apologize, especially for those that really love these buildings. I'm not trying to criticize them as buildings. I'm more critical of the fact that they try and pretend to be something they're not. One such project, of course, was the transformation of Castell Coch. Originally a 13th century fortification, it was actually even older than that. It goes back to Roman times because it was a fort that overlooked the valley going into Cardiff, which would have been important for early warning signs for the Romans back in their major fort in Cardiff. The reason why it's called Cardiff is because it had a Roman fort at the center of it. It was reimagined by Burgess under the Marquis's direction into a romanticized medieval castle, complete with highly decorated interiors and rich furnishings. Similarly, Cardiff Castle also underwent extensive renovations, blending its Roman and medieval origins with Victorian Gothic designs. The Bute family's efforts revealed the castle's Roman past and transformed it into a Gothic fantasy as we see it today. Now, specifically, I just want to make this clear. That's the palace area, which if you're looking at the building from the front entrance, I know this is really specific. If you're never been to Cardiff, this is going to be confusing. But as you walk in the entrance, to the left is the palace. To the front is the original Norman keep. And the walls that are surrounding the building is where you can actually see the Roman remains. Because if you look at the walls, you can actually see a difference in the types of stone that are being used and how they're formulated. And that's how you can tell which one's which. And you get that instruction when you go there. So I would definitely recommend going there. And if you're interested in any or all of that, because I think it's fascinating in any respect. And I've taken my family up the rickety steps up Cardiff Castle a couple times and been very nervous by it, not going to lie. I'm pretty sure health and safety is better than when we went up in 2000, where I just basically defended my child from falling off every side. And that's kind of where we see that influence being developed in those two buildings specifically. But I know he was also involved in the preservation of Caerphilly Castle, which is a different situation where Caerphilly has not been changed to match modern or Victorian aesthetic, and it is much more the existing castle with some flourishes built to actually accentuate the medieval nature of it, to kind of give you a concept of what the medieval would have looked like, which I think is, as I've said before, it's a complicated experience for me with the Victorians, because for every time I sit there and I get upset with what they've done because I feel like they've gone out of their way to make things worse, I do want to point out that there are lots about them that made things better and are very important to us in understanding and knowing where we're going as a society. So I will always re-establish that whenever I'm talking about these people, that just because one side of it makes me annoyed doesn't mean that it's all bad or it's all wrong. So getting back to our story, and specifically about John Batchelor, let's kind of wrap his life up. Despite the challenges he faced, Batchelor's contributions to Cardiff were not forgotten. In recognition for his dedication to the city's development and his advocacy for freedom, a bronze statue was erected in his honor in the Hayes in Cardiff in 1886, much to the frustration of local conservatives at the time. The pedestal bears the inscription, "The Friend of Freedom," a testament of his enduring legacy and political understanding of a new society on a new course. As time moved along, of course, so too did Cardiff's general reliance on its position in Wales. Thanks to the work of the Marquess and Batchelor, the changes were rapid and the former village was an industrial powerhouse. With growth, of course, came civic development. Cardiff became a borough in 1835 under the Municipal Corporations Act. This allowed the creation of a town council, better urban planning, and public services. Schools, churches, and public buildings, of course, would spring up out of this, and Cardiff also developed a vibrant press. Newspapers like Cardiff and Merthyr Guardian spread news and information, strengthening a shared civic identity. There would be, of course, Welsh language and English language papers. All of these things would compete with each other, and in latter parts of the period, we would also see the beginnings of Cardiff's cultural transformation. The town's new wealth helped fund institutions like the Cardiff Free Library, established in 1861, and improvements in transportation, including the arrival of the South Wales Railway in 1850s, which brought Cardiff closer to the rest of Britain, making transportation around Britain easier. This was, of course, a pivotal period featuring two men who were at the center of that period. They were the tensions which existed between the entrenched conservative viewpoint of the aristocrats and some businessmen and the labor classes and the business classes of the progressive liberalists who wanted society to change. Their conflicting visions of the city's future not only shaped its politics, as well as its economic trajectory, but also contributed to the architecture that we see today. And landmarks like Castlecock and Cardiff Castle stand as reminders of this dynamic era. No matter what you might think of them, they are important landmarks to the history of the period. And even today, as you wander around and you see a lot of these chapels that were built, most of which were built in this period. A lot of Cardiff isn't really old. Like, unlike a lot of cities in this time period, which are indeed growing, there isn't a strong central medieval area which you can go to and say, oh yeah, it's definitely, it looks very modern by comparison. Not helped, of course, by the bombing of Cardiff, which happens during the Blitz. But you have a big change in the way the city is structured, the ebb and flow of population density and how it springs out and spirals out away from the center. And even today, you can kind of see this methodology being carried out continually. The Victorian era is still painted in effect on the walls of the churches and the buildings that pre-existed the modern century. And I think that's an important aspect that we can look at and recognize. You know, we spend a lot of time in the Welsh History Podcast talking a lot about the ancient period, the medieval period, the Roman period, and, you know, the Renaissance, where there was a lot of movement towards independence. But it is important to remember that a lot of Wales' population growth and explosion and urbanization changes the tenure of most of the cities and towns that existed here before that, to the point where they are literally unrecognizable. You know, the small, sleepy little village of 1801 is nothing like the growing almost city of the 1870s. This is a very modern society by comparison, with all of the problems that come from being a modern society. And I think it's interesting to see that growth. We're going to, just to be clear, we're going to spend some time talking about the different urban areas. We've talked a little bit about the rural areas in the last episode. We're talking about Cardiff today. We'll probably go into Swansea in more detail, into Newport, into Wrexham, into other areas like Carmarthen and into Carnarvon, and talk about how and why these places grew the way they did and why they become the centers they become. The reason why Cardiff is the capital of Wales comes out of this period of accentuated growth that just doesn't stop. And it becomes such a pull for the population towards the city that little communities spring up around it, in part because of that, and are merged into Cardiff as a whole. Like St. Mellons, for example, like Penarth, like so many others, where they're almost like an American suburb, if you want to use that example, where they were separate, but now they're just a part of the major city. And all of this has come about because of how central the city is to Wales as a whole. And I think that's important for us to understand. And I think it's a aspect of Wales. And if you're not a big enjoyer of Cardiff and you live in Wales and you're like, oh, why are you talking about Cardiff? Don't worry, we're going to get to other areas. I want to explore other areas in this period because I think it's important for us to get an idea of what's going on in each of who are the pushers, the pullers, what is the reasons why places are growing, why are they dying? And we've talked a little bit in these two extremes, but we're going to continue to do this because I think it's good to understand that as we go forward. Also, it gives me time to talk about areas that maybe just don't get a lot of attention because they aren't massive, historically important in previous times. So now you can go into them and talk about them in depth. We've talked a little bit about Merthyr. Actually, I'd say quite a bit. We talked a little bit about Newport. We're going to spend more time in some of these places and talk in further depth about them because major things are happening there and things are changing, and it's important for us to talk about it. So with all that said and done, I'd like to thank you for listening or watching today. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, as always, you can reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com. You can reach out to me on Facebook at facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast, or on any other social media platform that I might be on at Welsh History Pod. I do try and respond, although I will say I sometimes miss stuff. I do try and respond as quickly as possible. And thank you, everyone, for listening. And if you would like to contribute to the podcast, you can do through patreon.com/Welsh History. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcasts is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcasts.com. Thanks for listening.